Hello everyone, I'm Meteorologist Johanna Wagstaffe. Thanks for joining us on Facebook Live to talk Tropical Storm Harvey. So if you have any questions about the storm, the track, the forecast, the impacts on the rest of the U.S. and Canada, I've got all my tools here in the CBC Weather Centre in Vancouver, so I'm happy to answer your questions. You can keep them coming throughout the Facebook Live. I just wanted to start off with an overview of where Harvey is right now. So I've got the latest satellite and radar on my weather graphics here. The storm made landfall for a third time, as you probably know, this morning in Louisiana. This was the third landfall after a Yucatan Peninsula landfall, a Texas landfall, and now right along the Louisiana-Texas border. The storm is moving inland and actually picking up speed. It is now about 55 kilometers north-northwest of Lake Charles, which is right along the coast. So it's picking up speed. It is weakening. It is still bringing a tremendous amount of rain, though, especially along that border. Let's see if I can zoom in here. So you can see the yellows and reds in the radar. This is where we're still getting intense downpours. I was looking at some of the numbers last night. Along that border, particularly in the Port Arthur Beaumont area, that was hardest hit last night and this morning with landfall. We saw rainfall rates of about 130 millimeters per hour. So that flooding threat has shifted eastward. Houston and Galveston area, luckily, the rain has ended, but the threat for flooding rains continues to shift eastward. Something else I want to show you on the radar. So the circulation you can really see just north of Lake Charles. That's where the center of Tropical Storm Harvey is right now. It is tracking towards the northeast, picking up speed. Still seeing a lot of rain wrap in around the back end. We always get counterclockwise circulation around a hurricane in the northern hemisphere. So a lot of rain on that back quadrant. Still looking at intense downpours on the leading edge of this storm. So from New Orleans through to Mississippi, these are the warnings in place right now. We've got tropical storm warnings, flash flood warnings, a tornado watch in place towards Mississippi and the Louisiana area. That's where we could see these cells swing up from the south and create isolated tornadoes. And then we have those flood watches all the way to the north. So if you've got any questions about Harvey, I've got all my tools here and we can track it out together. We've got our first question from Yasharahala asks, is it headed to Oklahoma? That's a good question. I want to show you the track. We're getting more confidence in what the storm is doing. So you probably know this has been a tough one to forecast. Hurricanes always are, but with all of the meandering that the storm did just off the coast of Texas, there was not a lot of consensus in the various weather models. So we've got a number of different weather models that we look at. They all produce similar forecasts, but based on slightly different initial conditions, and that's how we have confidence in our forecast. I want to show you what the forecast is looking like. I've put in a number of the forecast models that I have confidence in. Let me just run this forward. This is what we call a spaghetti plot. So I don't know if you can see all of these different tracks. These are all of the various paths that Harvey might take next. And you can see they're all pretty much indicating the same thing, that northeastward track. We've got a high confidence, good consensus in this forecast track now. So it does look like it'll be moving out of the Louisiana area up through the Ohio Valley. Oklahoma might get hit with some heavy rains, but the storm is moving much faster than it was when it was spinning off the coast, so not as intense as far as the rainfall rates go. Got another question, and keep the questions coming. If you're just joining us now, I'm Meteorologist Johanna Wagstaffe here at the Weather Centre in Vancouver, tracking Tropical Storm Harvey out for you. Ben Barini asks, do you think that it will come out to the Gulf and get stronger again? Good question. We've seen this storm meander and swirl, make several landfalls. The good news, as I just mentioned, we have strong consensus in the forecast models that it will continue on this northeastern track. So it does not look like it'll get wrapped back up in the Gulf again. I want to take you to the radar. So again, you can see this storm spinning. I want to show you the past track because it really gives you an idea of how erratic this storm has been before this third landfall. You can see the past track here in blue. Here's that first landfall it made Friday night into Saturday in Texas, meandered about just inland of the coast, went back out to the Gulf where it strengthened over the weekend and earlier this week, slowly tracked towards the Louisiana border, making landfall again this morning. Now it's actually got caught up in the upper atmosphere, and that was the problem before. It didn't have anything to guide it along, but now it's caught up in the upper atmosphere. And I just want to show you something over on this computer. One thing we look at is the winds in the upper atmosphere to tell us where the storm is going next. Before, I don't know if you can see, these are surface winds. There's the rotation around Harvey. It was just sitting and spinning for 5 days, but now it's getting caught up in the atmospheric river or the jet stream in our upper atmosphere. So that's going to guide it northward. That means there's a very low chance it'll get caught back in circulation in the Gulf of Mexico, which is some good news. Troy Kirchhoffel asks, what's the Gulf water temperatures? That's a good question. I don't have the exact numbers, but I do know that they've been running above normal this summer. In fact, for the past few summers, Gulf of Mexico temperatures have been above normal. I can see if I can pull up the numbers a little later on. I imagine they're probably in the high 20s, if not low 30s, but above seasonal has been something that forecasters were worried about, because the warmer the waters, the more fuel for hurricanes, the higher potential for stronger storms. There's a lot of other factors when looking at potential for strong hurricanes, but these warm Gulf waters were something we were worried about. I've got another question from Pat Robital. Is it normal for a storm to make landfall so many times? Great question. It is not out of the question to see a storm landfall so many times. Let's see if I can just open up this map for you. What's different about Harvey is that it ended up spinning in such a small area, funneling in Gulf of Mexico moisture over and over again. So this is the past track map. So you can see Harvey actually started way out off the coast of Africa. That's often where our hurricanes start this time of the year. It followed a general pattern westward through the Caribbean, making landfall in the Yucatan. So it actually crossed over the peninsula. At that point, I think it was a tropical depression. It then entered those warm Gulf waters where it rapidly strengthened to Category 4 and then made that first landfall in Texas. So it's not out of the question that we can see storms, especially around this area, make a couple of landfalls in the Caribbean, cross over the Florida Panhandle, cross over the Yucatan. But again, what is unique is these multiple landfall points so close to each other. I think the center of Harvey has only moved something like 200 or 300 kilometers since that first landfall, and that puts Harvey in a category of its own. If you're just joining me now, I'm meteorologist Johanna Wagstaffe, tracking Tropical Storm Harvey out for you. It is still a tropical storm. It is weakening though, and if you have any questions, please ask them on Facebook. Got a question from Sean Trainer. Was this storm made worse by current climate change? Will we be seeing more storms like this with the new climate? I'm glad you asked this question because it is a complicated answer, but it's one that meteorologists and storm forecasters have been thinking about a lot lately. Hurricanes are naturally occurring forces of nature. They've always been difficult to predict, and they've always occurred. Harvey is not a direct result of climate change, but where climate change does play a role is how devastating it ended up making Harvey. And just really quickly, a couple of factors. The first one is really that circulation we keep talking about, the fact that Harvey got cut off from the natural flow of storms and was forced to sit and spin on the coast. It led to such devastating storms. I want to show you the pattern, the upper air pattern that has been in place basically since the weekend. So here's Harvey spinning off the coast of Texas. It wasn't allowed to move northward because it was blocked by these systems in place. One big high pressure ridge, if you're watching from the west side of Canada, this is what's brought us the hot and dry weather. That's locked in place. There was also a low over Ontario. If you're watching from the east, all of those thunderstorms, these two systems were blocked in place, not allowing Harvey to move northward. And recent studies show these blocking patterns are a direct result of a warming climate. The jet stream isn't as strong, it meanders more, it gets stuck in place. That's something we're worried about when it comes to climate change, these stalled out systems. Another connection to climate change is the warmer waters and the warmer atmosphere can generally hold more moisture. There's a lot of other factors at play, but definitely adding to the devastation. Question from YouTube, will Southern Ontario be affected by Harvey? I was hoping somebody would direct me there. Obviously, I have a A lot of different graphics to track out. I want to show you the rainfall forecast for Harvey, and in a nutshell, Ontario will not see the kind of rain that we've already seen across the coast. So as I track out the rainfall, these whites you're seeing here, that's where we're looking at another 250 millimeters, and the hardest hit areas will be northern Louisiana as this storm track moves it towards the northeast. This white area is basically the heaviest rain and the center of the storm. But then it kind of stalls out over the Ohio Valley. It doesn't get caught up in a jet stream that brings it north. So while we are looking at a few showers over this weekend in Ontario and the Great Lakes, at this point the models do not bring Harvey up into Canada. It stalls out before then. I just will mention something that I was looking at, and I know the Canadian Hurricane Center has been watching this storm. If you can see it just off the coast of Africa. This is, let me just get it up for you, Tropical Storm Irma. And the Canadian Hurricane Center watching this storm. It's still days away, but it might end up skimming offshore of Atlantic Canada. So there are some special weather statements in place. Harvey, though, not expected to impact. These are great questions. Keep them coming. Michael A. Curie asks, was this the worst year in recorded history for hurricanes? It's an interesting question because there's so many different ways to rank hurricanes. I'll have to check some of the exact numbers, but I know we had one of our earliest tropical storm developments on record. I don't think it's a record for the number of hurricanes, but what this year will go down for is one of the most devastating hurricanes on record. This was also a record for strongest hurricane to landfall in Texas in, I think, over a decade. But what is exceptional and historic with Harvey is certainly the amount of rain. This is the most rain we've ever seen with a landfalling tropical storm in the continental U.S. ever on record since 1895. So this has been a record year from that standpoint, not necessarily from the number of hurricanes. Zachary Collison asks, could we see one as bad someday in Canada? Good question. With warmer waters continuing to expand up the east coast of Canada, there is real concern that we could end up with a strong storm, if not a hurricane, making landfall on the east coast of Canada. We've seen them before, and as we saw with Superstorm Sandy, it doesn't necessarily have to still be a hurricane making landfall in Canada for it to be devastating. What we're really worried about is these storms transition from gaining its fuel and energy from the warmer waters into a regular storm. They can still be just as potent, and with a storm surge being a bigger factor with climate change, more populated coastlines, more impacts of severe weather is certainly something that forecasters at the Canadian Hurricane Center is watching. If you're just joining us now, I'm meteorologist Johanna Wagstaffe. We're tracking out Tropical Storm Harvey for you. It made landfall for a third time again this morning along the Louisiana-Texas border. It has begun to pick up speed, and that is a good thing. It was basically spinning at walking speed for the past 5 days, but now that it's picked up speed, it can finally move out of the area, and rains hopefully will begin to end in the next couple of days. We've got a question from Dennis Lawson. Isn't it time to make the link between Harvey and global warming? I'm glad there are so many questions on this topic. As I mentioned earlier, climate change is not the smoking gun when it comes to Hurricane Harvey, but climate change has certainly had an impact on how devastating Harvey has been. I think there is a link between stalled out systems and climate change, and that's what forced Harvey in part to spin off the coast. Warmer waters, a warmer atmosphere is all playing a role. It's not the only role, of course. Infrastructure, when we look at the coastline of the Gulf of Mexico, has always made it vulnerable to storms, and with an increasing population, there are certainly multiple factors. Climate change is one of them in this case. These are great questions. Keep them coming. Let's see. Is this hurricane the reason Canada has had a really hot summer? That question comes from Krum Filipov. There is definitely a connection, and I'm not sure where you're asking this question from. I imagine Western Canada, because it is not being hot in the east. I want to take you back to this graphic. This is a look at the weather patterns that have been in play since the weekend and through the early week. If you're watching from the western side of the country, you've had an exceptionally hot summer, and I know we're dealing with new forest fires in Saskatchewan and Manitoba today. It has been a record season in BC, all thanks to this persistent high pressure ridge. We get sinking air around a high pressure. That generally means hot and dry, and that has meant explosive fire conditions across the west. It has been exceptionally hot and dry. This ridge has not gone anywhere. It's blocked in place, and that is what locked Harvey in on the coast. Our high pressure system in Western Canada stopped Harvey from moving northward. So yeah, there is a connection between the two extreme weather events. Logan Henderson asks how much more rain is expected in Texas. Let's take a look at the rainfall forecast. We've got a number of different weather models we look at. I've been using a U.S. rapid update model. There are a number of U.S. and Canadian models. This one seems to be handling the system the best. As I mentioned earlier, it's been a tough one to forecast, but now we have more confidence in what's going to happen next. So taking you forward in time, you can see Houston right here. Here's the Texas-Louisiana border, taking you through to Friday morning. So in the next 36 hours, most of the new rain will be in northern Louisiana and then up towards the Ohio Valley. It looks like we may see a few lingering showers in Houston. The worst is over, though, for Houston and Galveston as far as new rainfall. It's going to take quite some time for those water levels to drop. We are still looking at significant rain, though, in the Texas-Louisiana border, but definitely the new threat has shifted eastward. Steve Niles asks, will remnants of the storm find their way to Canada? Just taking you through this forecast map, as I mentioned earlier, this storm is not expected to move all the way up to the Canada border. We may end up seeing indirect impacts, some showers across southern Ontario this weekend. You can just see this rain track, that it sort of ends before it gets up to the lower Great Lakes. It sort of stalls out before it actually gets into southern Ontario, so that is some good news. I'll just show you the forecast track for Harvey over the next couple of days. And again, we do have high confidence in what's happening next, relatively high confidence. So tracking through northern Louisiana, sort of ends up tracking just east of the Ohio Valley, and then it stalls out just south of the lower Great Lakes. I don't know if you can see, but this icon is tropical storm. So right now it is still a tropical storm. Sustained winds are, I think, 65 kilometers per hour. It's weakening quite rapidly, and I imagine in the next few hours, later today, it'll be downgraded from a tropical storm to a post-tropical storm. That means it'll no longer be gaining its energy from the warm waters because it's over inland. It's basically turning into a big old low pressure system and picking up speed too, but it basically stalls out before it hits Canada. These questions are great. Keep them coming. Let's see. Excellent questions. Jim Cantor asks, what mainly influences the path of these storms that move across the Atlantic from Africa? So that is also, these are great questions. I want to take you back to what I'm watching right now in the Atlantic, because there is another tropical storm that's just formed. So around this time of the year, a lot of our storms do develop off of the west coast of Africa. This is just north of the equator, and that's where we get a lot of thunderstorm activity. We basically have the flow in the northern hemisphere, which is generally west to east, the flow in the southern hemisphere, which is generally east to west. Having those two directions creates a lot of instability, and we get a lot of pockets of thunderstorms around the equator. And we get this general east to west flow off the west coast of Africa. This is where we see a lot of thunderstorms develop. These pockets of thunderstorms can end up becoming organized over the coast and end up following that equator flow westward. And then once these storms enter into the Caribbean, the waters are very warm. That's where they can become even more organized, turn into a hurricane, and then get caught up in the upper atmosphere flow in our neck of the woods. So this is where it'll find the jet stream, and that ends up sort of becoming a path. You can kind of think of tropical storms and hurricanes as a cork being dropped into a river, and the river is moving in one direction. That's our jet stream. That's the flow around our highs and lows. That's what'll steer the storms. In the case of Harvey, it got caught off from that general flow, so it was like a cork bobbing in the water without anywhere to go, which is why it really was so devastating. Valerie Murphy asks, when will the storm end? We've really turned a corner today. Unfortunately, that came with a landfall, and there is some serious flooding happening right now in the Port Arthur Beaumont area of Louisiana, right where this storm sort of made landfall. Intense flash flooding, storm surge still an issue. We still have tornado watches east of the center. So this is very much still an active situation for the Gulf Coast. Now that it's moved inland, though, it can finally pick up speed, and that's what we were waiting for. This ongoing rounds of rain being dragged in from the Gulf was what caused such a devastating outcome. But now that it's picked up speed, I think we'll really see some improvements. Rain should begin to taper off in the next 24 hours for the Gulf Coast. Unfortunately, there are these are the warnings in place right now. These greens are the flash flooding, and you can see they actually extend all the way up into the upper end of the Ohio Valley and towards the Cincinnati area. That's where we could be looking at localized flooding. Nothing like what we saw along the coast, but this is still a serious story as it tracks through Memphis, Nashville, major population. So we could be looking at some big impacts. But again, nothing like what we saw on the coast. If you're just joining us now, I'm meteorologist Johanna Wagstaffe on Facebook Live today, tracking Tropical Storm Harvey out for you. Already had some great questions, and you can keep them coming. Waqar Ahmed Khan asks, what can you say about not just the severity, but the increasing frequency of these storms? Hurricanes are a tough one. We know with certainty that climate change is impacting extreme weather events. We know that they're increasing the frequency and the severity of extreme weather events. However, hurricanes are a bit of a different beast because there's so many different factors. We know that ocean waters are warming, and that is more fuel for hurricanes. But on the other hand, the other main ingredient when it comes to hurricane formation is wind shear. So if we've got winds moving in different directions in the upper atmosphere, that can tear storms apart. And we're still trying to figure out the link between climate change and wind shear. We know that storms impacts, when they do happen, are becoming more severe because of climate change. We don't necessarily know if hurricanes will be more frequent, but we can say with certainty that the impacts of storms because of climate change, the extra storm surge, the extra intense rainfall, the extra populations on coastlines, that is definitely increasing. Sharon Blake Wright asks, what about the solar eclipse that happened? Does that have anything to do with it? Fair question. You know, we think a lot about tides when we think about storm surge. In this case, there is no connection between the solar eclipse and the impacts of Harvey. However, the moon is playing a role in the impacts. We do have storm surge warnings along the coast. And if I can just go back to, I get a lot of my information from the National Hurricane Center. They do a detailed analysis. They're the ones that send out the hurricane hunters. So I've got raw data as well as analyzed data that I'm always looking at. And I just want to reread, they were talking about the storm surge timeline. And so the storm surge is lining up with tide right now, which is why it's such a big problem along the coast. So when you get a storm surge plus high tide, that's a big problem. So the moon is playing an impact. Something else I just want to mention with storm surge is that can actually amplify the effects we see from intense rainfall, because the water's all pushing up against the coastline. When you get the intense rainfall happening inland, it can't run out to the coast because the storm surge is keeping that rain locked in. So storm surge not only causing coastal flooding, but it's also not allowing the rainfall to filter out. I've got a few more great questions. Let's see. Can a boat navigate the Trinity River from Dallas to Houston? I'm not really sure what the state is right now. Here's Dallas and here's Houston. The rain has ended. Water levels, though, are running very high in this area. A lot of waterways still have to peak, and I don't actually know the area well enough to say if it would be you'd be able to navigate it by boat. I'm not sure if the Trinity River, as you mentioned, would be one way, but I'm not sure what the situation on the ground is right now. Things are getting better, though, as far as rainfall. Hamdam Mahdi asks, how bad is the rain going to be in Kentucky? We are going to see significant rainfall in Kentucky. At least it's fast moving. But again, taking you back to my forecast rainfall totals, the white areas is That's where we're seeing the 250 to 500 millimeters of rain in the forecast, but definitely not as bad as we were seeing earlier. So you can see it does skim through parts of Kentucky. The extreme northwest might see some heavy downpours. Generally, though, the situation is not as severe as it was for the coastline. And just taking you back to the warnings and watches I've got, you can see everyone in green under some kind of a flood flash or warning. So this is still very much a story as we head into the end of the week and into the weekend. We're still looking at serious flooding along the Ohio Valley. We may be looking at cresting rivers, but the storm is moving fast enough. We won't see the kind of rainfall totals we saw along the coast. Let's see. These are great questions. If you're just joining us, keep them coming. Judy Demmer asks, did Harvey have anything to do with the flooding in Windsor? Yeah, interesting question. And there is a bit of a connection. So the flooding that we saw in Windsor, if just a brief recap, Monday night and Tuesday night, intense thunderstorms in Windsor led to something like 200 millimeters and some flash flooding in Windsor. That was not directly connected to Harvey, because as I take you out to the big picture, let me load this up a bit and get my angles right here. This is all live radar and satellite data, by the way. So here's the circulation of Harvey. You can see sort of how wide the rain bands have spread out, so not really touching southern Ontario. However, that low pressure system that was in place Monday and Tuesday sitting over the lower Great Lakes that led to these thunderstorms, that actually in part blocked Harvey from moving northward. We had the high pressure in the west and a low pressure in the east act like a wall, not allowing Harvey to move forward. So here's a snapshot of earlier this week. Big high in the west leading to the heat and wildfires. Big low in the east. That's been leading to a very soggy season. These two were stuck in place over the past couple of days, so Harvey really had nowhere to go. So there is a connection, but the flooding was not in Windsor, was not directly linked. Marie-Louise St. Jacques asks, what's the projected impact of Harvey on Canada, Montreal, or Toronto? Yeah, this is definitely an important question for us. It is not going to have a direct impact on Canada, the latest models do suggest. And again, we're getting more and more confidence in the models, more and more consensus. As I take you through the rainfall forecast, again, you can kind of see it ends up, there's almost a line before it gets north into the lower Great Lakes where Harvey sort of stalls out. So we may end up seeing additional thunderstorms. As I mentioned earlier, there is a tropical storm in the central Atlantic, Tropical Storm Irma, that the Canadian Hurricane Center is watching for Atlantic Canada. I think it's just going to be a brush through early next week, but Harvey at this point not expected to have big impacts on Canada. I'll just show you that track again. This is the Harvey storm track. Here's Harvey right now, about 65 kilometers inland. It's going to pick up pace quite rapidly. In the next 12 hours, I think it'll get downgraded to a post-tropical storm. It'll continue tracking up the Ohio Valley through Memphis, through Nashville, but at least it's faster moving. And then it sort of loses its speed just south of the lower Great Lakes. Things can change this far out. Now we're talking Saturday into Sunday, so we'll have to keep an eye on it. But at this point, no major impacts in Canada. Crum Philip, again, Filipov, I'm really sorry, is asking, why do hurricanes appear in North America, not in Europe? We do see hurricanes sometimes cross over to Europe. These are really interesting questions. We've got several different cyclone basins around the world, and it really has to do with where we've got warm bodies of water that can hold hurricanes. So the Atlantic basin basically runs through the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, and up the coast of Canada. Sometimes, and I'll just change my satellite view, I can basically add on any satellite from around the world. These weather graphics we have take in data from weather stations and weather information sources from around the world. So I'm just going to change this to global. So you can see what's happening here. So here's a global view, and I'll just take off the lightning for a second. So sometimes hurricanes, as they track up the East Coast, they naturally move into cooler waters, so they naturally start to weaken. Sometimes they survive the crossover of the Atlantic, generally not as tropical storms, but still as very strong storms and can make landfall in the UK. But because the general flow off of Africa is east to west, and then these storms get caught up in our systems. They really don't take that turn north into Europe. We do have other basins around the world where we see hurricanes. Of course, the Eastern Pacific, we get a lot of hurricanes, and then the Philippines, Japan, in towards India, we can get a lot of cyclones in this area, but generally Europe isn't in a location for tropical storms, but still remnants of storms. Michael Curry asks, has climate change always happened? People may have an impact, but isn't it a natural occurrence? The climate is definitely changing at an unprecedented pace. It's changed faster than we've ever seen it before in history, and we can look pretty far back in time based on different sources like core samples in the ice. So yes, the climate has changed before, never at this speed. And I imagine you're wondering what the connection is to Harvey. We've always had hurricanes as well, but we're starting to see an increase in the impacts because of climate change. So there is a connection there. Okay, we've got one more question for you. This has been a whirlwind, but excellent questions. It's really nice to have so many engaged people when it comes to such a devastating storm. Okay, so last one here. Judy Demers asks, I saw that they say they haven't seen the worst yet. Is that true? That has definitely been the narrative over the past couple of days. Even up to last night and this morning before that landfall happened, we were still worried that the worst was still to come for some areas because of that third landfall. So now that it has made landfall, and this is the latest radar right now, you can see that circulation as the storm moves inland Louisiana. We're still seeing significant and intense flooding along the Louisiana-Texas border. We've also got that storm surge occurring, and we've got isolated downpours and isolated tornadoes, all possible through to Mississippi. However, for the coast, things are going to get better finally as the storm picks up speed and moves inland. The rain is going to ease. We're really just at that point starting the process of seeing what's being left behind, and it is going to take some time for water levels to drop. But in the next 24 hours, we'll see some major improvements when it comes to rainfall. We're watching the Ohio Valley next, but again, it's a fast-moving storm, so it won't be nearly as bad. And at this point, Canada doesn't look to be impacted by this storm. So that's all the time we have. Thank you for joining me. I'm Meteorologist Johanna Wagstaffe at the Weather Center here in Vancouver. And yeah, I'll keep on tracking the storm throughout the day. Thanks for joining us.